Hi there. So today I just thought I'd do a little run through on some different kinds of soldering iron because, sort of thing, if you're just getting into this or you just want to buy yourself an iron for occasional work, there are so many different choices out there, and there's so many things which just don't seem to get mentioned. So I just figured, should you wish to purchase an iron, whether it be for doing like electrical work, sort of soldering up wires together, or circuit board work, um, just give a run through on some of the things to look out for. Should help you sort of decide on what kind of iron it is you need. Well, first thing you've got is power. You'll see that a lot. You'll see from anything like 18 watts right up to a couple of 100 watts. You know, Power is handy, but it can be quite a misleading figure because I've had 50-watt irons which were just frankly useless, aside from, working on circuit boards, and they had their ass kicked by this old solid trusty Antex XS 25 watt. So yeah, it depends on various issues. Well, not issues, various properties of the element and the tip of the iron itself, which combine to work with the power rating to sort of, it kind of determines how the iron's going to behave. So you see this one. This is a beast of an iron. Here's my finger. This is 60 or 65 watt. This is one of CPC / Farnell's own brand. It's called Duratool. This is the 25-watt version of that iron. This was a Maplin's 40-watt iron. Obviously, unfortunately, Maplin are out of business. But to be honest, you can see you look at the two Duratool, it's a very, very similar kind of construction. This is the on these kinds, like this, you can see you've got two screws. When you look down from above, the tip actually just pushes into the iron, and one of these screws does it. You only need to undo one of them. One holds sort of this whole assembly together, one holds the tip in. You just back screw off half a turn, the tip will pull out. These are the different tips. So this is for the 60-watt iron. This is for the 40-watt iron. This is the 25. You can see they're slightly thinner or thicker diameter, whichever way you're going. And obviously, like all irons, you can get completely bogged down on the dimensions and style of the tip. Is it a point tip, a chisel tip, a knife edge tip? Is it a wedge tip? But yeah, these undo these tip in element type irons, whereas these Antex ones, on these, the element, that's fun to do with one hand, the element is in the iron, and the tip, that's a bit of swans, where is it? There, that's the element, and that's the tip. So element is in tip. These are tip in element, these are element in tip, or tip over element. Yeah, it doesn't really affect the way the iron operates. It's just something to do with its physical construction, really. Now, for a beginner, someone who's just starting out and wants an iron that will do just about anything, then one of these is absolutely fantastic. This is actually the first soldering iron I ever brought myself. I can remember as a kid, I'd probably been brought one or two and had some just cheap, sort of real cheap sort of thing you'd find on eBay these days, cheap couple of quid irons, but the equivalent of what you'd get from a shop back then, yeah, I can't really remember how good, if they were good or bad or whatever. It didn't really get a lot of use. But yeah, this was the first iron I brought myself. I actually brought this one back in 2004. It's a bit of a Triggs broom, this, because the only original things left on the iron are the yellow handle and the cable and the I've got a massive cable tangle up here. The strain relief has let's come back here. Sorry about the dodgy camera work. The strain relief has broken away now. It's just floating down the cable. Well, how these ones are, obviously the tips are replaceable and interchangeable. But the element is actually, if I get some focus, come on. So the element is screws into the handle, and the wires from the mains are soldered onto it, and the whole element, when it burns out, is interchangeable. I think this one is about on its 4th element by now. So yeah, I have done a shit ton of work with this iron, and I mean a shit ton. It has done no end of bits and bobs. Circuit board work, building, soldering up circuit boards, desoldering, repair work, wiring work, cars, bits and bobs. It's done some miles. It's got chucked in my bag no end of times when I've headed off somewhere to help someone do something, or take it around someone's house to have a look at something. So, and it has been a great iron. So cheap, reliable. It takes a long time for these tips, these elements to burn out. Problem with this is the tips on these things are stupidly expensive, and if it'll focus in on it, let me just put it down. You can see it's sort of, they start to corrode, like near the top here, they start to open up and it all sort of just slowly corrodes away. I've got some newer ones which don't appear to have that in, and I got these from Maplin. So yeah, if I get my bag here, you can see the newer ones, they seem to have done away with that gap. But I would just say this one, trying to take it off the iron, was an absolute sod to just do then. And you can see it's not had hardly any use at all. Now these ones, when they've been on the iron for a long time, they sort of just want to become part of the element, really. So I don't know whether, because this has sort of got like a hexagonal kind of piece of metalwork in it, so I don't know whether these ones, they did away with this slit design and put in a sort of metal, kind of just a piece of metalwork that's sort of sacrificial, so it doesn't get fused to the iron after hundreds of hours of work. I don't know, I've not used one of these tips long enough to take it off. This is the last one I have of this style of tip. The rest of them are burnt out. So yeah, anyway, that's the Antex iron. So yeah, good iron, the old Antex one. So this one, duratool. Now, in comparison to the Antex one, this is pennies. I think this is literally a couple of quid to buy the iron new, and the tips are about £1 each. Now, this is a good iron. This is also a good iron. This is the 25 watt duratool one. It has a very similar property to the Antex one. It has good thermal mass, which means it's got a big solid tip. It's got a big solid element. It's not temperature controlled. It takes a while to warm up. You just plug it in and leave it. It warms up and you start using it. Now, if you start using it a lot, like you're constantly going from joint to joint to joint to joint, it starts to lose its heat, and eventually you might suddenly find yourself, your solder's not flowing as nice as it wants to. If you're on a big joint, you just can't seem to get the solder to melt. Well, in that case, you just got to put it back in the holder and, you know, give it 30 seconds to a minute to let it get to full temperature again. Now, that doesn't really happen very often. Under normal use, circuit board use, you'd have to be soldering quite a lot of large legged components, sort of, you know, like your thicker legs, like on bridge rectifiers and stuff, rather than your thin legs you'd find on capacitors and resistors. you'd have to be soldering a lot of them in quite quick succession to have that scenario happen. Where it's more likely going to happen is if you're trying to solder sort of onto a big ground plane. If you've got a ground plane, let's say it's got a couple of, like your fast on, they're called fast on, you might know them as spade connectors. If you're trying to solder them, you'll find the first one you do be fine. The second one, all of a sudden, it just runs out of puff. It's no great problem. Again, you just put it back in the holder, give it 30 seconds to a minute, depending on how big the joint you're trying to solder is, and away you go again. Now, why that's important is, like I said, I don't own a soldering station, if you notice. I've got lots of irons. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 irons and no soldering station. I don't own a soldering station because if you want a decent one that's actually going to work, as far as I am concerned, the ones you're going to get for 20 quid, 30 quid off eBay are only any good for soldering components onto circuit boards, resistors, capacitors, things like that. They have a 50 watt element in them. Like I say, these Antex and Duratool ones here are 25 watt, but they're what's called temperature controlled. So you have a dial, you set the temperature you want, and away you go. The idea is once you start using the iron and it cools down, you've got a big 50 watt element, it can put a big burst of heat into it. However, the construction of all the temperature control ones I've seen are, the thermal inertia of them is so low because they're all element. They've got real, the tip itself, the amount of metalwork in the tip is small, the amount of metalwork in the element is small. It's all relying on the energy being put into the element when that element is turned on to heat that iron up. Now, that works fine on small components, but when you have a big chunky component, you'll just suddenly find you'll put the iron on it, and no matter how much that element runs, it just can't get the heat from that element to the tip. The element's warming up, the solder station is just knocking the power back or cycling the element rapidly on and off. The element's hot, but the tip isn't, and at the end of the day, it's the tip that's doing the soldering, not the element. So you can get, don't get me wrong, you can get some that work perfectly. I know there's like the Heiko, or however you pronounce them. They have ones where the element is actually sort of in the tip, and so is the temperature sensor, and they've got like a 200 watt element or something daft, and you can literally set them at the point where the solder is only just hot enough to melt, and you can ram them on like a piece of 0 gauge cable, feed the solder in, and that element can just get so much heat into that tip and into the area you're working around, it will just start melting. So yeah, I would say if you want a soldering iron that's going to be used for anything other than just soldering up a few small joints on circuit boards, do not buy a cheap temperature control one. You're better off just buying a stand and a 25 watt iron. Now, 25 watts isn't some magic number. It just seems to be a good power rating for a do everything iron for 90% of your work. Your circuit boards, you're soldering up a small wire, wrapping like a wire around a capacitor, soldering it onto that. It's going to have its limitations though, and when you get to your thicker, bigger stuff, big ground planes, thicker wires, it's just not going to cut it. Now, you can put an iron on something, get some heat into it, and eventually it'll heat up hot enough to feed the solder in. However, the longer you keep the iron on the thing you want to solder, that's the more time heat is traveling away from the thing you want to solder and into things you don't want to get hot. And that is where these 25 watts are let down. So that's where, again, go up power. Don't be tempted to go and buy a 50 watt soldering station if you want to solder heavy duty work. The soldering station you'd want to do that will cost you an absolute arm and a leg. It's not going to be a cheap piece of kit. Go out and buy yourself, and I really do recommend these cheap Duratools. Now, as far as, obviously, you're not going to get a maplin 40 watt iron anymore, apart from maybe someone's got a few on eBay for sale or something. These Duratool ones are absolutely brilliant for a cheap iron, and I've watched some reviews on some cheap irons, like Big Clive has done some really cheap ones on eBay, and he does a good review actually. When I was on about the soldering stations, he does a good review on the soldering station he uses, but he does say the same as what I've said, that it just lacks that ability like even a cheap 25 watt Antex has to when it gets really hot to just shove some heat into something for a quick burst before the element cools down. But yeah, you can get these duratool ones in 25, 40 and 60. I think it's 60 or 65. I seem to feel it's 60. But so I would say if you need a standard do everything iron, either if you want a cheaper one, get something like this duratool. I think they're very similar to like a Weller or a Silverline one, but these are quite cheap. I've not really looked at the price of the other ones. I'm not going to say whether they're any good because I've not used one. These are cheap and they work. These are more expensive. They work. The tips are very expensive. If you want a selection of tips, you're going to pay a lot of money. You'd be better off buying several irons and putting different tips on them, which is what I do. I'll get back to that in a bit. But yeah, if you general work 25 watt, if you need to do something, you know, if you're doing work on circuit boards that have a lot of ground planes and stuff on them, then it's 40 watt iron, purely because A, it's got more power, so it's going to be running a bit hotter to start with, and B, the tip in it you can see is obviously of thicker construction to the 25 watt one, so it's once it's warmed up it has a greater thermal mass. Now if you want something that's going to do some cable, you know, some thick cable, some thick solid joints, this thing is a beast. This 60 watt duratool iron, you can see that the tip on it is chunky. It is a chunky tip. It's, you know, it's thicker than the almost thicker than the external part of the element on the Antex iron, on the tip even. It is solid as well. That's the thing. It's not hollow. It's solid. Once it heats up, it holds some energy, and it gets bloody hot. This absolutely gets stupidly hot. I shit you not. If this has gotten up to full temperature, you can turn it off, go back to it 5 minutes later, and you can still melt solder on the tip. So yeah, for real heavy duty work, and again, it's a few quid's worth of iron. Problem I do have with it is it won't fit into any of my holders. It's too big. You can see it's sort of just, that's as far as it goes into that one. Won't go into that one. But it's not really an issue because it's not the kind of iron you want to just turn on and leave in a holder chugging away. It's going to get too hot, and realistically the sort of jobs you're going to use it with, you're going to plug it in, use it for a minute or two, turn it off again, and put it back on the shelf for sort of 6 months. So yeah, it's not really a problem to me that it doesn't fit in a holder. I'm not going to go out and try and find a holder to put it in. So yeah. So anyway, back to tips, back to realistically why I actually own 3 25 watt irons. So hang on a minute, let me just untangle some of these cables. So yeah, anyway, so me personally, obviously the next step is you figured out what kind of iron you want. So let's say you're going to do general PCB work, mostly. Let's say, you know, you want to build yourself a few amplifiers or something. So you've decided you're going to get a 25 watt iron. The next one is, well, what bloody tip do you need? Because there are so many. So you can see this is a, if I focus in on it, this is just a needle tip. It's a very fine point. This one is what would you call that? It's you can see it's not. I'm guessing that's probably more of a chisel tip. Or is it be a wedge? One of these is going to be a chisel and one's a wedge. You can see this one on the Antex iron is only got an angled surface on one side. The other side is flat. As you can see, the one on the duratool is angled both sides, and they both meet in the middle of the tip's width. I don't know, is one a chisel, one a wedge, probably. But anyway, so if you're doing surface mount work, then you're probably going to want this, or a very small chisel tip. 90% of what you do, if you're going to just do general printed circuit board through hole components, you want this tip. It's I can't tell you how big it is. It's sort of a medium sized. Yeah, I think that's a chisel. That is a chisel. Yeah, that's a wedge, because a wedge, am I right? As a wedge, you put it in and the idea is it forces things, whereas a chisel, yeah, if you've got like a wood chisel and stuff, it only has the curve on one edge, doesn't it? And it's flat on the other. So this is a, I'm going to say this is a chisel tip, and this must be a wedge tip. But so yeah, anyway, this tip, so you hold the iron, and you're holding the iron, and it's basically you're looking at it from one side. So you're right-handed, you have the tip, so it's to the left. You feed the solder in from the left-hand side. You're pushing it up the component. If this is your component, you're going to push the iron up to the component, and then you're going to feed the solder in from the other side. Job done. Get some terrible lighting colours in here. The white balance is all over the place for some reason. Hang on a minute. Yeah, it's even worse with the light off. So anyway, yeah, for most of your work, sorry about the really shit camera work on this one today. So yeah, for most of your work, if you want a general purpose do-it-all tip, then get a medium-sized chisel tip. I thought I was trying to focus on. Focus, come on, focus on something. Thank you. So wedge tip, just as handy again, but beauty of the wedge one is you can sort of come in round the back of it if you need be, or if you're trying to get between components, it can be a little bit easier, especially desoldering. If you've got sort of a multi-pin chip, you can sort of get this wedge in, and you've got your solder wick on. You can kind of get some heat to either side of it in between the legs, rather than trying to come in from one side. So yeah, and like I say, so again, on surface mount stuff, a fine point or a very small chisel tip, realistically, too big, and what happens is you get so much surface tension of the solder onto the tip of the iron. As you try and pull the iron away, you end up quite often pulling the component away with it. So if you're gonna, you can see this one is actually a very fine, I doubt I'll be able to focus in on it. So yeah, it's a much smaller wedge tip. It's smaller than the wedge on that one there. Certainly a lot smaller than the chisel tip on there, but it's ever so slightly bigger than the fine point on that one. So this is what I have, and rather than constantly messing about changing tips, I've just obviously, because I can go from some jobs you're working on, you might find yourself going from desoldering to soldering to actually having bits of surface mount stuff. So yeah, I just have a couple of irons, and rather than letting the iron cool down, changing the tip, I just plug another iron in. If I'm going to use it briefly, use it, unplug it, chuck it to one side. So yeah, but I'm not giving a lesson on soldering today. Plenty of people cover it. I'm just giving my opinions through quite a lot of experience on irons. So if you're gonna get into some soldering, you don't need to go out and spend an arm and a leg on a branded soldering iron. I would definitely recommend staying away from the cheap 50 watt, 65 watt temperature controlled irons if you're planning on doing anything other than just soldering components onto circuit boards. So realistically, out of these 25 watt irons, it really is basically down to a matter of personal preference. Now the duratool one, both of them oddly enough seem to end up, so the way the strain relief and the wires put in that, they want to sit with this screw sitting upwards as the wires dangling down the back of it. This one, you sort of hold it kind of like a pen. It's got 3 flats on the surface of it, so your thumb ends up on one, your finger on the other, and you end up resting your, sort of like you're holding a, kind of like holding a pen. The Antex one has a couple of flats much higher up the handle, and then it has several sort of I don't know what you call them, recesses, actually around the tip, and you sort of end up resting. This one, you more sort of end up, your thumb is resting on the flat, most of it. Your finger finds its way into one of the sort of cutouts, and the other flat of it just sort of ends up resting against your hand. It's a very comfortable iron to use. And again, like all irons, you need to find how you want to hold it, and you're going to have to position your tip. So it's no good if I'm holding the iron like this and the cable naturally wants to fall that way, making the iron want to sit this way. If I try and turn it, you see it just wants to fall back. That's the way the cable likes to bend. So the way it wants to sit, it's no point having the tip facing the wrong way. You need to make sure you get your iron and have your tip. So the tip, I'm right-handed, I'm coming in from the right-hand side to the left to do my soldering, to meet the component. So I want the flat of the tip facing that way. And it's the same with this one. It sits in my hand like that, so one side of the tip you can see is that way, but so yeah, I've got both sides of the tip. And the cheapy maplin one, I do like this iron. This is a good iron. This has got some, you can get some heat on with this and some good thermal mass. This one again is just round, you just hold it wherever you want, but again the cable kind of dictates how it wants to sit, and so again you can see the tip sort of comes off at the angle. The only other thing really is soldering iron holders, well, stands I believe would be the correct term. You don't really want your iron just flapping around on the bench, because you're going to pull the cable, it's going to end up on the floor, it's going to melt your carpet, it's going to set your house on fire, I don't know, it's going to start a nuclear holocaust. Yeah, it's at some point it's going to end up on the floor or on you, it's going to burn you, it's going to burn your floor, it's probably going to have solder on it which is going to flick everywhere and go in your son's eye or something, whatever, you know. It'd be a pretty poor choice to just kind of use an iron and leave it flapping around on your bench. So the exception being this one, but like I say, this isn't a plug-in leave on all the time iron where you're going to be constantly putting it in and, well, picking it up, putting it down, cutting some joints off, moving to the next one. It's you've turned it on, you've put it to the side, you're waiting for it to warm up, you do the thing you want to do with it, then you take it out of the area again. You could get a holder for it, I'm sure they make them, but I don't feel the need to own one. I don't use it enough. So you got some very basic ones. This thing actually comes with the Antex iron. Kind of reminds me, if you've ever seen like those little cheap hexamine, fold out hexamine stoves, it just kind of reminds me of one of them. But basically around near the element there's some slits in the handle, so it just fits into them. It's not secure, but it holds it. There's some little holes here, you could actually screw this down to the workbench, and yeah, it's one of those, it's not, as you're working away, it's not going to jump off, but you know, it is quite secure on there, but you give it a good knock, you're going to pull it off. Obviously these are going to be far more secure. Now this one is nice weighty stand. It's got a little pot for cleaning your iron off with in between joints. It's got obviously it's got plenty of holes to let air go through it in various places. Try and keep it cool. So the tube is hollow, and then round the actual mouth of it there's some cutouts, they let air through, and some holes drilled. I find with the Antex one, if you actually look, I don't know if I put it down on the table, come on, focus, it's sort of melted around the front here, and that is where it's been in this stand, and it's got hot, because this iron, if I push it all the way in, it blocks a lot of the airflow, because it's got such a narrow handle on it. It can seal quite well against the front of the mouth of the stand. So yeah, well, obviously it's normally back a bit more on the way the cable relief is. You can see it's wedged itself in there. So what I have to make a conscious effort to do is just pull it out a bit. It just lets some air flow around it, because yeah, when it goes right in, it blocks a lot of the airflow. It gets very hot. The duratool one, again, it will sort of seal in there, and although there are some holes to let air through, it kind of, I want to get some cool on it, because I find this one, again, if it's wedged, if I leave it in there like that, if I'm using it a lot, this handle starts to get hot, but this screw in particular again gets hot, and it's right where you put your fingertip, and you can actually feel the heat from that. So again, it's just a little, leave it slightly out. Now this type stand, this is like two springs, wobbly. So this is two springs. You got the outer one is the main frame of it, and the inner spring is actually what the element sits in. Now this one, I like with it, I'll take these bigger, I can't put this iron in the other stand, it's too chunky. It fits in this one quite happily, and the beauty of it is, because it's all just spring, although it is a bit floppy and wobbly, and you sometimes go to sort of catch the stand as you're trying to pull it in and out, it does allow the iron to run a lot cooler when it's in. If it's in there for a long period of time, you know, especially if you forget to turn your iron off, you go make a cup of tea, and you know something comes on the telly, or you get distracted and forget about your iron for a couple of hours. If it's sat in there, you know, it's never great to leave your iron on, but there's less chance of something getting so hot that you end up melting or catching fire with it in there than you are in this type one. So again, yeah, the duratool one fits in here, but it's a bit, it's just, you know what I mean, it's just a bit of a, it's a floppy stand. It's a shame the there isn't like another mounting point. I suppose I could do that, maybe. I suppose I could like sand this down and braze a piece of bracing from there to just hold it. It just sort of, it looks flimsy, it isn't, but just that whole, yeah, this outer spring wants bracing. So if you're going to buy a stand, first of all, make sure that your iron will fit in it. And yeah, secondly, just consider if it is the kind of stand where your iron seems to block the airflow, just don't push your iron all the way in. Just leave it out a bit, let a bit of air in. Yeah, or, you know, you could use the cheapy one. This is never going to overheat on this kind of stand, because you can see it's got plenty of airflow, but this leaves your tip exposed. You can catch it. You're going to knock it off this one very easily. But so anyway, yeah, basically it's up to you. You need to decide what is it you're going to solder, how often you're going to use your iron, and how likely is it you're going to end up sort of doing work on items that are outside your planned area of usage for your iron. So, but I would say if you just want a occasional use cheap iron, 25 watt duratool from CPC or Farnell, they're the same company, just different names. Job done. Just get a, I don't think I've got the, yeah, I can't think what it's like. I don't know, it looks about 3 mil maybe, something like that. It's not particularly big. It's a, there wasn't a massive amount of choice on the tips. There was like fine point, small tip, big tip, and this is like the small tip. So yeah, it's the next size up, I think, from what basically they do is the fine point. It comes standard. This iron, and that iron all came standard with a fine point tip. I seem to think the Antex ones come standard with the chisel tip on them, and you have to buy a fine point. But yeah, medium 25 watt iron with a medium chisel or wedge tip is going to be realistically your most useful kind of tool for soldering. If you fancy splashing out a bit, you don't mind spending money on the tips, then buy the Antex. Now, like I said, the elements on these burn out, and ironically enough, if you want to change the element, you need a soldering iron, because you have to solder it and then resolder the new wires onto the new element. Which is why I ended up with the second one, actually, because this one had broken element. No, I used to use my gas iron to solder it up, and I was in maplin. I know what it was. I needed a soldering iron. I was working on a job actually, so yeah, I needed a soldering iron. I went to Maplin's. I brought a new iron, and then I acquired another element off of eBay for this iron. Put a new element in it. I thought, well, I'll get a different tip. So for ages, all I had was this iron, that iron, and like a gas iron, which actually, if you give me a second, oh, there goes one on the floor. Now these are useful, but they're not any good for general solder work. They've got you have a catalyst in the head of them. So rather than flame, they actually burn internally. It's a catalytic. It's like a silver something. I don't know. It's platinum and silver or something. So basically, as soon as it starts to warm up, the gas then reacts with it, and it catalytically works. I don't know exactly. It's some catalytic process which ends up generating heat. So you see, if I light it up. Hang on, bear with me. Hang on a minute. So it's the flame quickly. I don't know if it caught it. The flame, it lights externally as a flame, and then it quickly starts glowing internally, and the tip gets very, very hot very, very quickly. Very good for occasional use if you're outside or something. Last time I used this was on a mate's motorbike. It was a windy day. You know, the bigger irons would have cut it. At the time I didn't have one. I was trying to use a 25 watt iron. It just wasn't getting hot. Just dug this out, whammed it flat out. It was within sort of 20 seconds. It gets so hot you can just about solder anything, but it's no good for electronic work. It kicks out huge amounts of exhaust heat. It's a big, bulky tip. It gets in the way of everything. It would just be melting and burning wiring. It's a handy, portable soldering iron. It is not. Do not be tempted to buy a gas iron as your only soldering iron if you're planning on doing any amount of soldering work. Realistically, they have their uses, but they're very limited. It's cooled down enough, and they need to stay, realistically, they're the workshop toolbox item, not your electronics workbench item. So yeah, any questions, please feel free to comment. If you've got any experiences with various branded irons, I think there's like some silver line ones, Weller ones like that, which are relatively cheap. Again, feel free to comment. I'm just trying to give someone, you know, there's plenty of soldering tutorials on YouTube. But there seems to be very little advice on how to select a soldering iron, really. So hopefully, if you've watched this video, I've answered some questions rather than ended up making you ask more. But I would say, just don't be afraid. At the end of the day, if you go out and just buy a cheap 25 watt iron, you're going to get some experience. You're going to then start to learn what it is you do or don't want. If you know, you end up like myself, starting off tinkering with things, ending up then learning a lot more until you end up designing, building, repairing, and doing lots of bits and bobs, then, you know, it still gives you experience. It lets you then, next time you pick up an iron, you might be around someone's workshop or someone's house and they've got an iron that you use. Rather than it just being a thing you use, you can then instantly start realizing how differently it works to your iron, and you know, you can then decide on things. But all of these irons together, I think, probably cost me less. All of this together, it probably cost less than £100. So you know, I think this one's probably the most expensive iron I've got. I think this was quite, because it's Port Sol. So yeah, but buy some irons, buy some tips, see what you get on with, see what you don't, and just don't be afraid. And yeah, stay safe. Try not to set your house on fire. Try not to burn yourself. Always wear eye protection. I wear glasses these days. My eyesight's starting to go downhill as I'm reaching middle age. But I spent many hours soldering without eye protection, and I was bloody lucky, because the amount of time, especially if you're doing a wire or a particularly stubborn joint, you go and pull it and also all solder will flick off. The amount of times that happened and I just shut my eyes. But realistically, if a piece had been heading for my eye, it probably would have got in my eye before I'd shut my eye. I've been in the hospital a few times with corneal ulcers, and I can tell you, when something is wrong with your eye, it is one of the most painful and prolonged experience you can deal with. Ask anyone who's had issues with their eyes, like foreign bodies, corneal ulcers, infections, and it's just, you can't even explain how bad it is. It is just absolutely destructive to your whole life whilst that's ongoing. So, and all of that can be avoided by just wearing a cheap pair of eye protection. So wear eye protection when soldering. You will thank me for it at some point. Thanks for watching.